This week's Torah portion is Vayera, and he appeared. And it begins in Genesis 18 with God's appearance to Abraham at Elonei Mamre, the oaks of Mamre near Hebron. It's a very interesting chapter. It begins with God appearing to Abraham. That's the first verse. And then the second verse, all of a sudden we have Abraham looking up and noticing three people who, of course, are three angels that are coming to visit Abraham. And they tell him about the fact that Sarah's going to have a son and they're going to call him Isaac, etc. And then that section ends and we return to God's appearance to Abraham. And it begins with verse 17. And God said, "Will I hide from Abraham what I am doing?" Of course, at this point, we know that God wants to destroy the city of Sodom. Actually, all the cities in the area. He wants to destroy them because the people there have been doing evil things. But take a look at what God is actually saying. He says, "Can I hide this from Abraham? Abraham is my loyal servant. I must share what I'm about to do with Abraham." And God then goes on to say, and this is in verse 19, "For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Eternal, to do righteousness and judgment, that the Eternal may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him." And then, of course, he goes on to talk about the fact that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham then turns to God in response. He has said this to Abraham. And Abraham's immediate response we have in verse 23. "And Abraham stood near and said, 'Will you also sweep away the righteous with the wicked?' And he goes on to say, 'Perhaps there will be 50 righteous in the midst of the city. Will you also sweep away and not bear with the place for 50 righteous that are therein?'" What's happening here? We have, first of all, a very interesting thing that I think you would agree is unusual. God is the Almighty. He is up above us. And yet, He's the creator of the world. And yet, he feels it necessary to tell Abraham what his plans are, not for a place that has anything to do with Abraham. God is going to be bringing judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, not where Abraham is. And yet, he feels it necessary to tell Abraham, to share his plans with Abraham. And Abraham's immediate reaction is to start arguing with God. "God, how can you do this? How can you kill the righteous together with the wicked?" Now, pay attention. When God first talks about the fact that he wants to tell Abraham of his plans, he says in verse 19, which I read before, that Abraham, the exact words here are, "For I know him, that he will command his children after him, that they shall keep the way of God to do righteousness and judgment." Righteousness and judgment in Hebrew, tzedakah u'mishpat. Now, if you think about it, Abraham is living in a pagan world. Abraham is unusual. He has recognized God. But it's not just the fact that he understands that there is one God who is the creator of the heaven and the earth. But here we have a completely new concept being introduced. Abraham understands that God is not like the pagan gods. Not just that he is one as opposed to many, but he is a God of righteousness and judgment. And this is a completely new notion, because pagan worship is all about supplication. It's all about trying to get the gods to find favor with you. So you bring offerings to a pagan god because you want to bribe him almost. You want to get the pagan god to like you. It has nothing to do with righteousness. It has nothing to do with judgment. And here, God is about to bring judgment on a city, and he understands that Abraham's primary message that he is giving to his descendants and to the world has to do with righteousness and judgment. It has to do with justice. And therefore, he is going to bring this plan of his to Abraham. And Abraham, in turn, immediately argues on the basis of justice. What if there are righteous people in Sodom? How can you, God, destroy the righteous together with the wicked? He understands that the wicked are deserving of punishment. But what he rejects is the notion that God would also take the righteous with them, because that is not just. And it is this sense of justice that Abraham demands from God. And indeed, God responds affirmatively. Not only that, though, Abraham goes one step further. He doesn't only ask for righteousness and for justice, he asks for mercy. Because the truth of the matter is, what Abraham actually asks for is, if there are a minimum number of righteous people within the city of Sodom, he is asking God to therefore forgive or refrain from bringing judgment against the entire city. He is saying, if there are 50 righteous people, then don't destroy the evil ones either. That's going even one step further, and God agrees. God here is presented as a God of justice and a God of mercy. And it is Abraham who is able, in his dialogue with God, to bring those qualities, those very important qualities of God, to us in the Scripture. At the end of the day, of course, there are not even 10 righteous men in Sodom. And at the end of the day, though, God does save the righteous people. The righteous people being, unfortunately, the only righteous people in Sodom are Abraham's family, his nephew Lot, Lot's wife, and their 2 daughters. Even the sons-in-law are not saved in the end, because they ridicule Lot and ridicule the message that the angels bring to him about the upcoming destruction of the city. Abraham has often been compared to Noah, the hero that we met a few chapters ago, towards the beginning of the book of Genesis. And one of the comparisons that is made is the fact that when God spoke to Noah and told him he was going to be bringing a flood and destroying all of mankind, Noah didn't argue. Noah didn't come to God in the same way that Abraham did and say, but God, how can you destroy the righteous together with the wicked? And I think this is a very important comparison, and I think we learn a great deal from Abraham and from the important role model that he presents to us. It is not only about his understanding of God as being righteous and a God of justice, but it is God being that close, it is Abraham feeling that close to God, that he is able to go to God and say, why are you doing this? And what about this? And I think this is a very important lesson, because I believe that this is something God expects of us. He expects of us to obey him, but he expects of us to expect of him justice. And therefore, yes, we can come and ask God, why have you done this? If in our perception it is not just. It's not about what if we are not bringing judgment on God. We are not giving our opinion. We are not saying God is wrong. But we can say, God, you are a God of justice. Is this indeed just? And I believe that's also what Abraham is doing. He asked that question, and it's a question that indeed all of humankind has a right to ask, especially when we are pleading the case of justice for our fellow man. Shabbat Shalom from Samaria.
Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom.